This is a short introduction and commentary to week 6. Mostly what I'm going to tell you here is to be on guard. To be on guard of your presuppositions and all of that baggage that you brought into class with you that you may have forgotten exists. Now, in the last week's discussion, some of this became very evident, and I've replied to some posts and I've replied to some students individually regarding this. How our understanding of our language and the concepts that the philosophers are using impacts our understanding of the philosophies themselves. So some people, and this is normal, not a criticism here, some people are really uneasy about the use of the word God. Of course we are, because, you know, we're Americans and we have to be uncomfortable about something, right? The way that this term is used philosophically is a little complicated, and Megan actually points this out in one of her reply posts. We don't need to understand it in the way that it's being used. So it doesn't change the understanding of the philosophy or the philosophical concepts at all. So Descartes, for example, thinks about a self-sufficient sort of primary substance, and he gives it the word God. Does it have to be God? I mean, no, it's a logical issue. The logical issue is that the thing that is substance is the self-sufficient thing. Otherwise, it would be dependent upon something else, and then it wouldn't be a substance, it would be an attribute. So in order to prevent something from being an attribute, it has to be self-sufficient. Well, let's just call that God. Okay, or not, whatever you want. Spinoza is an easier sort of example. The concept of God there is, first of all, it's not like any concept of God that any of the modern monotheistic religions understand. God doesn't really have any will, doesn't have any power. It's just sort of the development of the universe, the unfolding of the universe itself, which actually is rather straightforward and in accordance with our modern scientific understanding of how things are. The universe just sort of does what it does, and it does so by deterministic laws. Why call it God? Well, because that's what Spinoza decided to do. He could have just said universe, lowercase u. It really doesn't change the meaning at all. But what does change the meaning is when we come into this with the presuppositions and all of this philosophical baggage that we've, picked up because we're alive and we live in societies and cultures and all of that. When we see that word, we have a certain association with it, and it may impact how we understand the material. So, some people are less likely to believe what Descartes says simply because it relies on the concept of God. Well, it doesn't really. Just change that word to something else. Primary substance. Call God primary substance. Just erase the word and change it, and it's amazing. It means the same thing. It's a minor criticism. It's just it can really impact how we view these philosophers and how much truth we can assign to each one. I can't really compare ontological theories if I'm biased in some way because, for example, I don't believe in God. I mean, it shouldn't really impact how I read this material. Even if it does, at least I should be aware of it. One of the reasons this is important is because we will keep doing this as the semester progresses. So this week in Chapter 5, one of the things that we're dealing with is the concept of artificial intelligence. Now be very, very on guard for how you're understanding this and the things that you're bringing with you. We, as humans, who have watched, for generations, we've watched movies about the machines taking over. I mean, Terminator 2 generation right here. This is science fiction, okay? When we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're talking about a machine or an algorithm or whatever you want to call it. It's basically a logical protocol that's emulating something. It's sort of, we're using them to emulate human thought. So the concern is thought, whether or not we can train or create or do something to make a machine think. What does thinking mean? Well, that's your job to figure out based on what the readings provide. Searle, for example, John Searle, who's a professor at Berkeley, he says, and he's made this argument for decades, that computers, in the way that we understand basic modern logical computers, basic logical machines, the kinds of things that run your phone and that sort of stuff, they never will be able to come to understand language the way that humans do. Now, when we say understand, that's the word that we have to be careful about. Understanding is just a word, and it's just like any other word, it's just like the word God, but it brings all of these assumptions and presuppositions with it. So I'm not going to tell you how it should be used or what it should mean, but when you're reading Searle on the Chinese room argument, when he's asking the question whether or not the Chinese room, that's really random because if you haven't read this yet, you're like, what is he talking about? If he's asking the question whether or not the Chinese room understands Chinese, pay attention to how he understands the word understands, because that's kind of the key. So anyway, this is just sort of a, snap you out. You basically had a week off, so try to get back to it. Always be aware of the presuppositions, and these are inherent in the language that we're using because that's how we're approaching this material. But the baggage that you bring to the table, it helps the interpretation or it hurts it. And not that there's anything wrong with saying, for example, that Descartes relied on God in his philosophy. That's true, he did. Does it impact how we understand or accept the material? Well, it shouldn't. That's a bias that we have brought to the table, not Descartes. Have a good evening. I will check in later this week.